Welcome everyone to our fourth anniversary SWET commemorative talk celebrating SWET's 40th anniversary. And I am particularly happy to have this opportunity to introduce old friends to speak and share from their long careers. Peter Goodman, and interviewing him, Beth, Cary. Most years, I returned from Tokyo to the United States for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And on these occasions, we usually have some sort of gathering in Oakland, often at Beth Cary's house or a restaurant, at which SWET members in the Bay Area and around come together and see each other. And this year, of course, I'm not going to the United States and no gathering is happening, but this is our chance to not only visit socially with Peter, but hear more about stories from his long career and share with everyone. So I'm really happy that we have this chance. It's even more of a pleasure to see everyone, old friends in SWET on this occasion. Another chance to celebrate our 40 years, which is we're still here vigorously working and doing what we want and connecting with each other. So today, very fortunate to have Beth Cary, who has agreed to interview Peter. Beth is in her home in Oakland, and Peter is, I think he's either in his office or his home in Albany in the Bay Area. And after we have the interview, we would like to open it up for questions. And this time we thought we would like you, if you have questions during the talk, feel free to jot them into the chat line. So that's our idea for today, and we hope to have a good 40 to 50 minutes in the second hour for direct questions with Peter and others, and hopefully some time for general socializing. And then we'll keep the meeting open after that for continued socializing as people are interested. We timed the meeting this time to be in the early evening in California, so we in Japan are over our lunch hour, but it's really great that we could get together in this way. We probably have people from other time zones as well, and really grateful for all your participation. Okay, Beth,
well,
over to you.
Yes. I am sure you have all read Peter's bio in the announcement, but Peter has been publishing at Stonebridge Press for 31 years now, because he said he established it in 1989. Before that, he did spend time in Japan. And so we want to start off asking him about his trajectory, but I just thought it'd be kind of interesting to realize that if publishing was included in the SWET acronym, it would be SWEPT, Society of Writers, Editors, Publishers, and Translators. But he does his fair share of editing, so we'll include him, of course, in all of the SWET acronym and the activities that SWET does. So I'd like Peter to talk a little bit about his initial learning about editing and his initial delving into this field. And maybe you could focus on the 2 or 3 skills that you learned early on that you still use, that have stood you in good stead, and talk to us about how you started off. Peter.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for having me and indulging me for at least an hour or so listening to what I have to say. I do want to mention, though, that if I owe any of you a letter of some sort of communication, I really apologize that I haven't gotten back to you. I'm not the greatest correspondent, and please nag me if you're waiting to hear. So I got interested in actually books about Japan as much as Japan itself when I was in my last year in college. We had a class in Japanese literature, and I discovered during the course of the class that almost all the books that were presented to us to read that I really liked, just because the way they looked with their object quality, had all been published by one of 3 companies that were publishing books in English in Japan at the time. Of course, those were Tuttle, Weatherhill, and Kodansha. And I got it into my head that I would like to go to Japan and make some of those books. And it took me a couple of years, but I finally did end up there. But I wasn't hired as an editor. I had to enroll in a school. And while I was enrolled there, I would call the companies periodically, and I connected with Tuttle at one point. Mr. Tuttle met me in the basement of, I think it was the Royal Hotel near the Imperial Palace. I think that's the right one. And he found out that I had done some rewriting work for a Japanese professor at Cornell when I was there. And he seemed to think that that made me qualified to be an editor. So he hired me. And I was to start like, next week or something. And I had no clue as to what I was doing. So when I first started out, they gave me some sort of introduction to some book to edit. And I looked at it and I just saw a bunch of words and I had no idea what to do. And they indulged me really for about, for all the time that I was there. Beth, you asked about what skills I learned there. I actually learned to be an editor and what an editor was while I was working at Tuttle. It was a really great opportunity. I had a fabulous boss, Florence Sakade, who many of you may remember. And she was a real taskmaster. She was very conservative, set in her ways, wanted things done this way. And so she set me on the straight and narrow and taught me how to edit. And there were some other editors there. There's a woman named Anita Feldman. I remember she had been with Dial Press in New York and was in Japan pursuing a romance that she had. And she was really experienced and she was very kind. I mean, she really could have dismissed me as being a real know-nothing, but she didn't do that. And she kind of sat me down and said, look, kid, this is what an editor does. And she had that New York mentality. So I was kind of blessed to have some very good mentors right in the very beginning. And from that, I just learned so much about editing per se, but also about how books were made. The thing about working at Tuttle is that, and this I suppose was true at Weatherhill and true at, I know was true at Kodansha as well. If you were the English language editor in charge of a project, they would run everything by you. They would ask you to look at their cover design, their choice of colors, their choice of type. You'd have to probably write most of the promotional material yourself. You'd have to work with the salespeople, explain to them why the book was interesting, et cetera. So unlike working in a large American company where all the work was compartmentalized, we really got to do everything. And it was a course of doing that, both at Tuttle and Kodansha, that I kind of got to understand how books were put together and all the different parts, especially at Tuttle, because Florence was really so strict. She wanted it done this particular way. I just learned to do it that way. And I bet you I'm still doing things Florence's way. I mean, without even realizing it.
Mm-hmm. And then you went from Tuttle to KI, Kodansha International?
Yeah, Tuttle got to be a real grind. And for those of you who worked for Tuttle, you may remember they didn't pay very much. I learned a lot, but they didn't pay anything. Right, Susie? So
they don't pay much anymore, even now, it seems.
Yeah, maybe they don't pay anything now. I don't know. I mean, well, you don't make that much money in publishing anyway. Being an editor is not a way to becoming rich. But at one point, all the editors left and it was just me at Tuttle. And I recall that I had it must have been about 25 or 26 books that were just on me. I mean, I was basically doing the entire line. And I got really tired doing that. And I found out that an opportunity for freelancing had opened up at KI. So I went up and met them and I got some jobs from them. And I gradually transitioned myself kind of out of Tuttle and doing more and more freelance work for Kodansha International, which was a completely different company and a completely different experience.
So that was more just editing at Kodansha International?
Well, it was still the same sort of thing where the foreign editor, as we called ourselves, we were in charge of the entire book. And they were much more compartmentalized. Plus, they had a lot more money. And we got to work on some projects that had some really big budgets. And they had big expectations. They had a big sales force. Tuttle actually had great sales force in the United States. They did a very good job with their books. Kodansha was in a way a lot more traditional in the way that their distribution was organized. But it was a Japanese company. So there were a lot of mysterious decisions that came down from on high as to what books were going to be done and what they were going to concentrate on and how much money was available. And the foreigners there we were like an island outpost, we're on our own little island, and they let us have the messy desks. They wouldn't make us make tea or do any of that. I mean, we weren't expected to do any of that sort of stuff, But at the same time, we were also not included in any of the important decisions. So we were just there to put the books out, and I think we did a pretty good job of doing that. But it was we were much more involved, I think, in the books and everything at Tuttle than I was at Kodansha. But not necessarily. I mean, it was different. It was just a very, very different scene. Japanese company versus Tuttle, which was basically an American company with an American at the top, but with a lot of Japanese stuff going on in the middle management.
What do you miss from those early days of that?
Oh, cutting and
Day you're
pasting,
in?
typing on, cutting up paper and sticking on the Scotch tape. I don't really miss a lot. The fundamental procedures for putting a book together, they haven't really changed that much. They've gotten a lot more efficient. I'm a lot more involved in a lot of the design and, creation of artwork than I ever was. So that's been a plus. A plus. I think we had a lot more, it's kind of like the nature of publishing was different then. Having a
How
book that had a
so?
lot of pages, long
Mhm.
chapters. English was a slightly different language then than it is now. I mean, it could be a little more stilted and robust. I think there is a kind of a dumbing down that we're all encouraged to do. Shorter sentences, more A-heads, breaking up the chapters. Get it to them quick. Don't let anybody have anything that takes more than 10 minutes to read without a break. I mean, I'm kind of aware of that as a trend in say modern American publishing. Plus, we had there were just a lot of crazy projects that both Kodansha, Tuttle, and I assume Weatherhill would do. They would never be economical today. They were just too expensive to produce. But at the time, using Korean printers and then the printers who were not as crazy expensive then as they are now, we could do some fabulous things. Lots of handwork, beautiful embossing on the covers, special what are called tip-ins, where you have like separate sheets tucked in. And they were willing to pay the money for that. I mean, Kodansha especially, they had a lot of money, and Kodansha International, I don't think was, maybe in their dreams, but I don't think it was ever really conceived of as a big money-making operation. It was to indulge some faction of the internationalist wing of the mother company, and it was supported by people who I guess saw the importance of. I mean, one of its jobs I guess was to promote Japan and Japanese culture, which was not necessarily Tuttle's mission.
Mhm. So when I was working at Japan Society in San Francisco, and I would have to put out a newsletter, and so I would send the text, the draft, to the printer, and they would set it all up and print it. And then computers started getting into the thing, and the idea was that we could create the whole thing in-house sort of.
Right,
And
right.
I felt like trying to learn all that, what it would be entailed to really do it in by myself was kind of dumbing down my
Oh,
skills, that I should be working on creating the content, not fiddling around with margins and then trying to fit it into a certain column and all that sort of thing.
I, yeah,
How
I
did
guess
you
so.
deal with the new technologies that were coming in?
I like doing all that stuff. I feel it's kind of putting a book together is kind of it's like a craft in a way, or I feel a bit like an artisan. It's like
Mhm.
baking bread. So I like being hands-on and having all that stuff. I like picking out the type. I like designing the pages. I'm not really super great at things like Photoshop, but I think I know what I can and can't do. So if I need something that is really more than is my speed, I will hire that stuff out. But I like having control of the process. And that's kind of what I was used to especially when I was at Kodansha International. The editors were very involved with the designers and laying out the books and looking at the pages and trying to make sure everything fit. And it wasn't just a slapdash effort to squeeze everything in, but we really tried to be very thoughtful to make sure that the artwork and the content were all nicely married. I will say there's one thing I remember about the perils of typesetting. When we were at Tuttle, all of our books were being typeset at, I think the company was named Sanwa. They were in Seoul, Korea, and I had a lot of books, so it didn't matter. I'd finish a manuscript, bundle it up, and would send it off to Seoul, and it would come back in 2 months typeset into galleys, and I'd read the proofs and we'd go back through all these changes. Well, Tuttle, for some reason, was doing a book on Japan and the Muslim world. And that book went off to Sama also. And every instance of the word Koran came back as Korean. Right better. I guess they either it was like, maybe they were doing us a favor. So I don't miss that.
So as an editor and publisher, you not only look at the content and try to get out something that's, worthwhile, but you also work to produce it and then promote it. What methods are most effective in terms of, getting the whole thing finished off and then promoting it?
Well, these days, making a book is nowhere near as technologically challenging as it used to be. We used to have all these different, printers, lithographers, camera people, et cetera. And now it's, as we all know, it's all kind of done. You get a PDF file and you can make a book out of it. So the bookmaking part has been pretty easy. And the challenging part these days, I think, and it's always been like this to an extent, is this promotion, publicity, marketing, basically trying to get people to care about the book. And we actually invest quite a bit of time and energy into trying to get people to talk about the book before it comes out. We have to have good materials for the salespeople, for the distributors. We send out advance galleys to blurbers, people who are maybe experts in the area or who have a big profile or big platform, big audience. And we try and get noticed before the book comes out. And then when the book itself comes out, we send out lots of review copies and lots of follow-up, email, phone, whatever it takes, because people want to be reached in different ways. So it's really, really challenging. You feel sorry for authors sometimes who, there was a story around 9/11, I remember, and there's a whole bunch of authors whose books were slated to come out on, just around that time, and they got completely blown off the newspapers, for good reasons. But the American, and I guess everyone's attention span is very short, and everyone is clamoring for attention. And there are a lot of people with a lot of money and who make a lot of noise who are trying to get attention. And so it's always a kind of a struggle to try to get people's attention, then hold their attention long enough for them to actually say, oh yeah, maybe I am interested in that book. Maybe I want to buy it. And one of the things about the Japan crowd or the Japan audience is that, if you tell somebody who's not on the inside, you do books about Japan, they think, oh, well, that's, it's Japan. It's just this big thing out there. But as we all know, Japan it's not a monolithic fan base. Some people are interested in food, some people are interested in language, some people are interested in design, travel, etc. So it's all very, very balkanized, and you have to get your message straight depending on who you're pitching it to. I remember the worst thing that we used to do was to go into a sales conference, and when the sales guy would say, well, who's this book for? We'd say it's for anyone. I mean, that's the worst thing. I mean, you really have to have a clear audience in mind. And these days you have to know how to reach them. Some of them are now on social media and on the internet, and they have very discreet communities that are a lot more accessible than they were 10 years ago. But by the same token, that might be a lot smaller, and they might themselves be kind of fragmented and siloed into very, very small interest groups. So you might spend a lot of time and you're only reaching like 30 or 40 people. And it's just really challenging. I mean, there's no, and it's not a formula that you can apply the same mailing list, the same technique, the same language to everything that you do. It's all very different. It's enormously time consuming and labor intensive.
So do you do all that yourself, or you have a horde of people that work for you?
Well, I wish I had a horde of people. I mean, that's definitely one of the limiting factors. And it's one of the things that I think gives, say, New York publishers a leg up, because they do have hordes of people. Mm-hmm. Some of them who work for absolutely nothing, just so they can say they work for a publisher. I'm a lot more limited. I've got Michael Palmer in New York. He's very good. He's got a list of people. He very aggressively contacts everybody and follows up. And I've got another guy, John Sokolov, here in Berkeley. and he puts a lot of lists together. And then we also use we're distributed by a national distributor named Consortium, and they have access to a lot of markets. They subscribe to different things where we can get our message out through their sales reps or through their PR. It's a combination of different things, but I certainly don't have a horde of people. I mean, every book is a challenge.
So it's probably hard to say because you have so
Can I
many.
say one thing more about that, Beth? Which
Sure.
is something
Of
very,
course.
very different from what it was 10 years ago. And that's that the authors now are expected to do a lot more of this promotion work themselves. They're expected to have a social media platform, to work it, to keep it up to date, to provide lots of contacts, to follow up, to call in all their chits. It's like time for you to get a review from your friend who works at The Guardian or something like that. And, if you talk to authors, a lot of them will say that they can't get published anymore unless they are willing to step up and, invest and promise to invest time in promoting the book to their own community. And it's not a bad idea because, as readers don't really care who the publisher is. They want to, if they can connect directly with the author, readers really like that. And I think authors really like that too. I mean, what better to know, that people are actually reading your book. So the publisher is kind of an intermediary.
Right. And now with all this technology, and then since we're all shut down with COVID, then all the kind of online platforms are really important, aren't they? I mean, this year must have given a big jump to all that, rather than having authors go from town to town, from bookstore to bookstore, promoting the book. They can't do that now.
It's been a real boon to small presses like us. 'Cause on the internet, it's on everyone's computer monitor. Everybody looks the same. It's the screens are the same size. You can't really tell how much is behind something just by looking at a computer screen. So it has kind of leveled the playing field. It's given authors a lot more opportunities and publishers a lot more opportunities to reach out. And that's made a huge difference. People initially thought that these Zoom, called virtual book launches, that was going to be kind of a temporary thing. But I think everyone has decided that, hey, I like this. Let's figure out how we can keep doing it. We don't have to pay money for travel. We can, instead of going to having an event at a bookstore where if you get 20 people, everybody says that's great. You can actually get 60, 70 people online with a little buy button right next to the book. So it's really made a big difference.
So has that resulted? Do you see it in the sales of the books? Well,
it's hard to say because, at the same time that's happened, the independent bookstores have all basically shut down and are now doing all their sales almost entirely through online. Amazon sales have picked up, but they were growing anyway. So I don't know. I wouldn't say that the aggregate, the sales have increased, but we haven't seen, say, sales decline. Just because the bookstores are all closed. The publishing industry is actually pretty healthy. It is an activity you can do safely by yourself indoors without being exposed to contagions.
So what's an average print run, or how are things in terms of ebooks and actual paper books? How does that work for you?
Well, an average print run, it just depends. The old print runs used to be 4,000 to 5,000 copies, and it's half that now. And we don't even know really what a proper print run is going to be these days, because with the bookstores all closed down, they're all being fulfilled out of these warehouses that are fulfilling for lots of different bookstores at the same time. So the stores don't actually have to order books anymore. They just have to make them available on their website. So we have no idea sometimes how many copies we're supposed to print. Some of it's just driven by how many copies do we need to print in order to sell them all and break even. That you do those sorts of calculations, which are just kind of backwards, but that's kind of what we're stuck with.
So do you have like certain books that have become bestsellers or long-term sellers that you within your lists?
Yeah, they are, they're called evergreen titles. And we have a couple language books. We did this book called Japanese the Manga Way, by this guy, crazy guy named Wayne Lammers. I don't know if they, so Wayne's somewhere in this mix of panels that I see, but that book continues to sell. It's a wonderful book, and Wayne labored long and hard over it, and so I'm sure he's glad to see it still in print. Which reminds me, I think we have to renew our agreement with Kodansha in the next year or so. So I'm hoping they'll allow us to stay in print because it keeps doing well. We have another book called Kanji Pictographics, which was, I think it was one of the first books we did. And it's a book that takes 1,000 kanji and it turns all the ideograms into pictograms, that look like things. They're meant to be a sort of visual mnemonics for learning the characters. And of course, that wasn't a new idea at the time, and it's not a new idea now. And there have been other books that do this, but this book, for some reason, did it exceptionally well. Had really, really clean lines, and it had a very nice layout. And so that book has done well over the years. We did have a book that was doing extremely well, and the author ended up taking it over himself because he was starting up his own publishing company. And this was a book called Wabi Sabi for artists, designers, poets, and philosophers, I think. And that we published that, and that was by Leonard Cohen, who also did this book called New Fashion Japan, which is on one of the slides that I sent in. So that book, so the New Fashion Japan, that was Leonard's book. And so when I was back with Stonebridge Press, he and I have worked together for many years now, and we did Wabi Sabi, and that book not only did extremely well, continues to do really well for him. He's got a company called Imperfect Publishing now, but it kind of created this whole Wabi Sabi thing in America that really didn't exist before this book came out. In addition to being a bunch of different books about the concept of Wabi Sabi as these American writers understand it, there's also a book about wabi as like aging. So you have a Wabi Sabi face, it's kind of wrinkled but full of character. There's a book about a Wabi Sabi, a cat, little cat named Wabi Sabi. And it's just kicked off this whole kind of design mode. So it's a word you hear a lot now, and I think that book had a lot to do with it.
So one of the books I proofread for you was Fred Schott's translation of the Osamu Tezuka story, which is like a manga form. And it ended up being a huge, big fat version. So you were talking about it would be an ebook and then sort of like a print on demand, was, as I remember, chatting in the shipping room of your office.
Well, maybe. Print on demand would be completely impossible for that.
Oh, really?
The page cost of print on demand books, it doesn't go down even if you print a lot more. So it would have been a monstrously expensive book.
So how did this?
Well, we ended up printing, I think it's 900 pages or something and Fred did a tremendous amount of work on it, especially on the bibliography on the back. I think it ruined Fred's shoulder for about 2 years. I don't think we ever thought of doing it as an ebook. It's just a gigantic brick.
So you actually printed a whole bunch.
Yes.
I mean, a certain number of.
Yeah. We printed in our second printing, I believe.
So, what other new things are in terms of digital publishing or ebooks or whatever that you are involved in or thinking about?
Well, just about all the books that we do now have ebook companions, and those have become, ebooks were supposed to take over the world. The print publishing was going to die, and everyone was going to be spending their time on their Kindles and their iBooks and stuff like that, and that just never happened. So our ebooks as a percentage of number of units sold, if you want to talk in those terms, it's somewhere between 10 and 15%, depending on the individual book. Other publishers, I think, are a bit higher. They're maybe up around 20%, particularly if they're publishing genres like science fiction, mystery, romance is big for ebooks. And it's just become another part of the business. It's not bad for authors because we pay authors a lot more money in terms of royalties for their ebooks than we do for their print books. I think by a factor of 2 well, 2 to 3, depending,
No, why would that be?
because I'm just really generous. Well,
The publisher doesn't incur as much expense because you don't actually.
well, I mean, that's the thing. The book
Okay.
is just a bunch of electrons sitting on a server somewhere, and
Mhm.
it's so yeah, it doesn't incur a lot of expense, and it's a particularly easy way of getting the stuff out there, and it can just sit there, and everyone else is doing all the work for it. So I think it makes sense, to pay the author more for that. But I will say though that, I mean, one thing that is a problem with the ebook market is that people do think that because it's just a bunch of electrons that it should be cheap. And the thing is that if you just think in terms of the editorial work that goes into a book, translation, editing, line editing, developmental editing, sometimes doing artwork and something, it's no cheaper to do that for an ebook than it is to do it for a print book. But you can't sell the ebook for as much money unless you're a textbook publisher, in which case you get a chance to rip off students to your heart's content, $80, $90, copies of books. But ebooks now, they have to be like $3.99, $4.99. And Apple has a rule. I don't think it's a confidential agreement that I signed, but if the retail price of the print book is less than, I think it's $24.95, the ebook cannot be more than $9.95.
Mm-hmm.
And if you price it more than that, they'll just drop the price, because we're kind of at the mercy of all these big distributors. The ebook marketplace is really, it's brutal. There's not a lot of money that is left over at the end. But there are always exceptions. You always find some author who does a tremendous job and makes a fortune doing it.
You mentioned that you really enjoy working with authors in terms of your editing portion of your work. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it depends on the author whether they're enjoyable to work with, right?
I guess that was the nice way of asking about it,
I mean, there are authors
certain authors
here tonight, so you're all wonderful people, and I've enjoyed you. I remember I loved working with authors, particularly when I was back in Tokyo at Tuttle and then at KI, because it was much more face to face. Got to meet all these people, and I really felt like I was being helpful. I remember that guy, Don Drager. Do you remember him, Susie? He wrote these books on martial arts. And I don't remember his background. He was a military guy, ended up in Japan at some point. He had arms like tree stumps. It was just amazing, but he was a super nice guy. And he was kind of typical Tuttle author in the sense that he couldn't write. I mean, he had no ability to put sentences together. So, well, I mean, that's probably being cruel. He was okay, but he wasn't really an author. He didn't get a whole sense of how to organize stuff. And so as an editor at Tuttle and later at Kodansha, especially with Japanese authors who would come in, they had books. You had these people with tremendous expertise. I mean, they knew stuff that nobody knew. And your job was there to just sort of, extract it from them and then try and organize it and put it into the form of a book. And for the most part, they were very grateful to have someone to do that. And they were a lot of fun to work with because, only a tenth of the stuff they do actually went into the book. So they'd regale you with all these stories of all their other experiences. It was really wonderful working one-on-one with those kinds of authors. And that was actually the nice thing about this whole Books on Japan thing to begin with, is that there was a lot of great information about Japan, a lot of history, tradition, all these details, but none of it had ever existed in English before. And so our job was to kind of pull that out and try and organize it and present it in a form that would be accessible to and understandable by people who didn't have any kind of expertise, but were simply interested in that subject area. And so it was a lot more than just mechanically working through the manuscript and doing copy editing. It was really helping assemble these thoughts into a particular vision and then putting that into a box, AKA a book, and presenting it to people we learned a lot about how to take very arcane material and make it accessible to a general audience or to a non-specialist audience. And that's what all these companies did. We weren't, well, Susie was publishing for an academic audience at Todai Press, but at Tuttle, Kodansha, Weatherhill, our books were not academic, but they had to be solid. They had to be accurate. They had to be well-informed. And we all developed I think, a very heightened kind of radar about who had the stuff and who didn't, who knew what they were talking about and who was bullshitting us. Because they found it really easy, I think, to bullshit their friends, but it was difficult when you put it down on paper. It's really hard to maintain that. Not that we didn't publish our share of crap. I'm sure we did.
So, and then currently you have, for example, how many books are sort of in process right now?
Oh, really?
On an average, about how many?
Well, I think we're doing maybe 4 to 5 books a season.
Mm-hmm.
It's particularly busy now because with the pandemic, we postponed a number of titles. Yeah, so this is a list of, these are books that just came out in the last year or so.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another slide of books that are forthcoming. Yeah, these are the ones that we're kind of actively working on, not to mention ones that have been signed up that we haven't quite dug into. So these are all different and they're all challenging in their way. So, but these are the books that we have coming out, and they're all kind of grouped into this coming spring. Tokyo Stroll is a fantastic guidebook to Tokyo. That was supposed to come out last July, around the time of the Olympics. Just after, actually, it was going to come out in August after the Olympics, because I didn't want to have to compete with all those other Olympic guidebooks that were going to be out there. But it got postponed once, and then got postponed again. And I just heard that Japan is going to be opening up to large-scale tourism in time for the Olympics. So I think we're definitely going to go ahead with this. And some of the other books got postponed as well.
So when books get postponed like that, then does the author have to rework some of it, or
oh, don't let them do that. Well, I actually, what I don't know if Giles Poitras is here. He was, I think he might have. Maybe I'll watch it later. Did a lot of work. He did a lot of groundwork. He went to Japan in November of last year and did all this research and got all the detail right. We've got like 140 maps or something. I mean, just a tremendous amount of work. But then the pandemic hit, and it's like, oh God, because what's worse than publishing a book, a tour book, that's already out of date the moment you put it on sale? I mean, they are by definition, but I mean, to have it a year out of date the moment it comes on sale. So we created an ebook, and Giles sent it to about 10 of his friends in Tokyo and said, take this with you. And if you see anything that's changed or different, let me know. So his friends are doing that, and we're expecting to get their corrections, I think, the end of December. And we're going to see if we can get them all in without having to completely lay out the book, because it's running to 500 pages, and I don't want to have to go and redo all that. Mm-hmm. But that is an issue, but that's because that book is particularly timely.
You have been doing a series of casts,
yeah.
Which have just wrapped up, I think you said, about independent publishing. What was the concept there? How do you enjoy doing that?
Yeah, I did enjoy it. I've been involved with this, as you see on the screen. The IBPA is the Independent Book Publishers Association. I've been a member of them since the 1980s, and I was on the board for a number of years from around 2010. It's an association. It's a trade association, basically, with over 3,000 independent publishers. Included in that are small presses like Stonebridge, but also a lot of author publishers, people who are just kind of doing it on their own or planning to. It's a really great organization, very, very supportive, good community. They have a wonderful publishing university that they put on every year. And, I like to talk to people, and I especially like to find out from other people how they do their jobs and what's important to them, and how does logistics work. If you're a printer, what keeps you up at night, what's happening with paper, how is InDesign changing, all those sorts of nuts and bolts kind of questions that, you can really only get a proper answer from someone who's been doing it for many, many years. It's really fun to talk to experts and find out what they know. So it was mostly just designed as an excuse for me to talk to people. On this, I just finished the last episode, which is episode number 60, and I feel like I did enough with that. I'm going to turn it over to IBPA, so they're going to take it on. But I do want to say, to anyone who's out here who is, listening and is writing a book and frustrated with the whole process, there are many, many avenues for becoming an author publisher these days that don't have that stigma that vanity publishing had 20 years ago. There are a lot of authors who are handling their own stuff, developing their own community, contacting readers, and they're not getting penalized for it. You may not get into a lot of bookstores just because maybe your book is only available on Amazon and bookstores won't order if it's only available on Amazon. But there's plenty of communities, there's plenty of stuff going on online, selling ebook only. You don't necessarily need to reach everyone through an independent bookseller. There's a lot of different ways of reaching people on your own. A lot of authors don't like doing that. They're not entrepreneurial, or they don't know where to start. So this, this association, IBPA, would be a good place to start. But if you don't want to do that, there's just lots of tools online. Everything you need to do it is basically there. But I mean, you do have to, pay a lot of attention to details. You do have to sort of think in terms of, I guess, being a business person. Writers don't necessarily like to get their hands dirty with that sort of thing, but it's more and more authors are doing it successfully.
So with Stonebridge Press now at 31 years, is it, since you started in 1989?
Yeah.
And your august age currently.
Thank you.
How are you thinking about the future? How do you see, publishing about Japan moving into the future? Or what are your aspirations for the future?
One of the things I wanted to emphasize is that I'm not really an expert on Japan at all, and certainly my language skills have deteriorated, over the last 30 years. So there's that. But I also, I was always more interested in books and bookmaking than I was in, promoting Japan for the sake of the Japanese government. I'm not a propagandist or anything. I kind of like what I like. And so my interests, I think, are probably pretty narrow, considering that Japan is an entire culture, entire civilization. It's got a little bit of everything. So my interest area is just kind of specific. So I'm not really an expert on, as things go, I suppose I'm an expert on publishing on Japan, but I don't think that's necessarily saying much, because it's so broad and it's changing in so many different ways. I know that there's, like, when I came back, everyone was in '85, everyone was scared of Japan taking over the world. The corporate samurai boardroom, they were all going to come in. And that didn't happen. Then for a while, everyone was learning Japanese, and then they began learning Russian. And then they began really eating a lot of sushi. And then they began learning Japanese again because they were all reading anime and manga. And, it keeps changing. So, if we have if we have an opportunity to publish something, I certainly am going to look at where Americans' interests are, because that's our primary market, is in North America. Like, we're doing Winnie Bird's book, Eating Wild Japan, which is a book about edible foods that you can forage in the Japanese countryside. And while that sounds like a very arcane topic, it's a very hot topic when it comes to, foodies and the locavores here in America. So you have all the interest that you have in Japan, people's fascination with Japan and the traditions that the Japanese bring, married to what is a really hot American trend. And that's kind of an ideal book in a sense, because it has a ready market for people who are outside that strict Japan orbit. And so if you've talked about the future of publishing about Japan, it's kind of like, well, where do you think the future of America or American taste is going to be? Because that is in part going to determine what publishers are going to be looking at. And you can see publishers jumping on the bandwagon. If you look, when I first heard the term forest bathing, Wow, that is a great concept. Immediately popped in my like that is super sellable idea. And I think a couple months ago, I looked, there must be like a dozen books with the word forest bathing in the title. And that's the sort of thing that happens. And so if we were to publish a book on forest bathing now, what could we possibly contribute to this conversation? I mean, the trick of being a successful publisher, I think, is to get there just a little bit before everybody else, but you don't want to be out on a limb and publish in an area that absolutely nobody is interested in.
So, for example, like you did with the Wabi Sabi, that was a real,
Yeah. I mean, maybe
it's sort of a
America was,
trendsetter.
well, and it's partly because of the way that, Leonard was able to pitch it and we were able to present it, because it came at a time when technology seemed to be taking over everything. And the thing about a digital copy is that the millionth digital copy of something, barring any mutations from gamma rays, is exactly identical to the very first one. Shows no deterioration, no change at all. And the thing about Wabi Sabi, I think, that appealed to people was that it was kind of anti-technology title, in the sense that it celebrated the idea that things get old and they go rotten and they age and they deteriorate, and that there's a certain beauty in that, because it exemplifies the process of the universe itself. People can make that sort of statement about it. So it was a nice antidote to people who felt suffocated by technology and felt dehumanized by all this aluminum. And you remember how all the office machines, they were always beige for some reason? People couldn't relate to that. So I think that book in particular, it just came along at the right time. But I don't think anybody was able to predict how much an impact it would have.
So as you could tell from the bookshelf behind Peter, he's really published a huge number of books, and he probably doesn't even remember how many of them. But a lot of them, he didn't mention that he is the first commercial publisher of our Japan style sheet. This was the second edition. So if you're a SWET member, you can get a free copy of the third edition, and you can always find it online. And Peter had published this for a good 20 years, and he was extremely generous. I don't think this happens, but he gave all of the digital files for creating this book to SWET, to us, so that we could produce the third edition without having to redo all that cost. And we had a designer in Kyoto who's been really helpful in our various tasks, do the corrections and updates that we put into this to put out the new edition, and also to create the PDF for the website. So without Peter, we really wouldn't have the long history. Of course, the style sheet began back with the publishers of the 1980s that he was talking about, and Susie Schmidt and Becky Davis and so many other founding members who contributed all their know-how and made it available for all of us who are working in publishing and editing to learn from. So, oh, cool. Yeah, this is his bookshelf. Yeah. I saw this last year when I was in his office. That was very impressive. And there's Anime Encyclopedia. That was so big when it first came out. So here's
these are examples of his in it early.
Yeah, those are early catalogs.
Madam Butterfly. There it is.
Yes, there you go.
Award for dedication to translation. Good for you.
I'd forgotten we even got that.
Yeah, wonderful.
Oh, we did all these Donald Ritchie books.
Yeah. I mean, people these days probably don't even know what a big contribution he made to getting Japan known to the world.
Well, like I was saying, I think last time I was on a Zoom with SWET, that I'm just kind of surprised that no graduate student has ever picked up the idea of publishing English language publishing in Japan as a thesis. for a graduate paper. It's a really fascinating and important story.
Well, I started creating this line project. I haven't really presented it to anyone yet, but that's the idea, is to chronicle all the things that were done. And if you start in 1853 and go up to the present, you have a quite amazing story, and you're part of that story. You know.
Is this a timeline of publishing, you mean?
Well, it's a timeline of what I call hashin. So the ways, all of the things that have been put out of Japan in English to explain its culture. And so it needs more work and discussion. It's an idea at the moment, and a kind of database is started, but nothing is moving on that right now.
Well, you remember when Florence Sakati died what year was that? Was that in the 90s?
Tribute to her on the SWET website. I'll have to look it up later.
Yeah, because you solicited like reminiscences from all these people, and it was fascinating.
If you look on the SWET website under I think it's Find People, it's one of the tabs, there's a section on tributes. And in there are tributes to Ralph Friedrich, Florence, I think, others who were involved in publishing.
There are a lot of books on France. There are a lot of books on England. There are a lot of books on Italy. There are just thousands of books on Japan. And they just keep coming. And I wonder if, I mean, obviously it's kind of ridiculous to speculate about this, but if we had not, if the occupation had not been there, you didn't have all these people who were experts in Japanese language as a result of their military training, and then who remained in Japan, and then Charles Tuttle doing what he did, and this whole publishing enterprise just would not have happened. Although I mean, there always was. I mean, there are those weird travel titles from the early 1900s, books about Japan, but they're, you know, they British travelers who would stay in Japan for 3 weeks and then go back, and I guess those boat rides were really long, so they would spend their time writing.
Book on the way home.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and there were also associations like the Asiatic Society of Japan, and various journals that published, etc. More recently, places like Monumenta Nipponica is it still going on?
Monumenta is it's going to outlast everything else, but like Japan Quarterly, which started in 1957, I think, and it ceased publication in 2001. It was one of the most broadly multi-genre periodicals, and it was, many of us SWET members were involved with the editing and translating for that. And it was in libraries all over the world. So it contributed a huge amount, but a lot of those publications were supported by the commitment of people with vision, knowing that Japan could contribute to the culture of the world, and also very much wanting the world to understand Japan after the defeat. So those periodicals had a big role in the culture of the 70s, 80s, 90s. And then with 2000, things really began to change, and internet and everything. And the media changed so much that most of the periodicals ceased publication.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Japan Interpreter, Japan Echo, all those.
So,
Okay, so now shall we start the Q&A part? Who has a question? So Alex Lipson asks, what was Boye Lafayette de Monte like? Did you work with him?
No, I didn't. He was a Tuttle author, a real mainstay and I did get a book submission from him sometime in I think it was the 1990s. Must have been a book that Tuttle rejected for some reason. But no, I never worked with him. He was like, I think when I started, even in 1976, he he was already well established as one of the old Japan hands, you know, had all the information, was writing books on how to be polite and how to do business, and all these like how to deal with the Japanese type books. That was his thing.
So you started mentioning the different opportunities for people to work on publishing their own material, etc. And I think we'll try to have some sort of program like that in the coming year. So maybe some of those ideas and thoughts can be shared during that session as well.
Sure. Yeah.
Mhm.
I assume that there are people in Japan who are doing that as well. I don't know what the setup is there for actual print-on-demand manufacturing.
Mhm.
Basically, they're kind of custom-made photocopy machines. It's toner on paper, but they're developed with this inline thing where it prints it on paper and binds it up and wraps a cover on it and does everything. They're kind of complicated machines that break pretty often. I don't know if any. I assume that Dai Nippon are developing some of those printing technologies. Does anyone know anything about that in Japan for print on demand?
Are you talking about people actually having it in their own
No,
offices and homes?
no.
No, but fancier than what we could do by taking a
I think this was basically printed
stick.
that way at
Yeah.
Komeyama Insatsu. They have one of those hugely long machines that
right.
you put the
So
data
maybe
in at
there's
one
a-
end and it comes out the other.
The SWET list
Yeah.
mentioned that the Japanese printing industry has basically squashed print on demand here because they would lose a lot of money. They were machines apparently in some bookshops. We'd have to go back to the list to find the post. But the person was saying that it's sort of like the industry here basically didn't like the idea of people just going into a bookshop, and like all things in Japan, they just put the heavies on everyone.
You'd think that they would have seen the opportunity and decided to own the technology themselves, but out
Well,
there.
I think the well-established publishing companies do already have the I know
They
that
must.
Komeyama Insatsu got the machines quite
They must.
early
Yeah.
because they knew that they're a small printing company. Their factory is way out in Iwate. So,
But you know, the way it's set up here in Europe, or in England at least, that I know of, in the States and Australia, there are companies that are designed, they're like consumer facing, you know, they're designed to deal with citizens, people who are not experts. And so they've got a whole interface that is easy for laymen to use. You don't have to be like in the industry and understand all the, you know, ins and outs of preparing PDF files necessary. They make it simple for people to do it. And then along with that comes the whole distribution into the bookstores and in places like Amazon. So it's a one-stop shop for authors to have their books printed and then sold. And they don't have to, you know, you don't have to be the expert in all the details. And I don't know if the companies in Japan are interested in doing that, you know, dealing with civilians as opposed to, you know, their colleagues in the industry.
I'm curious about pitches and submissions from the point of view of a publisher. Are there any red flags that you see often in a pitch or a submission that stand out for you in terms of things, best practices that writers should avoid to make their pitches and submissions more professional or enticing to publishers?
Yeah, well, a couple of things come to mind. I mean, one killer, which should be obvious, but isn't to a lot of people, is that you got to proofread your submission really carefully and don't let any typos come in, because that really goes against your credibility as a, you know, as a writer. So the amount of care that you take with your submission is a signal to the amount of care, you know, you're going to take with the work. We have a list of things we want to see in a submission. You can find it on our website. If you can't find it, write to me and I'll send it to you. But it lists the kind of things that we're looking for, which I think are kind of generic. Most publishers are looking for it. I should think that the best thing to do is not send the whole thing at once. Send a brief letter with short paragraphs saying, here's what I have, here's who I am, here's who this book will appeal to, here's what I know about the market and how big it is. and send it to that and see if you can get some interest that way. Publisher is much more likely to read a short to the point letter than a long submission that requires, thoughtful consideration. As I was saying before, these days it's like really important to demonstrate that you have an awareness of the market, that you might have a social media presence, particularly when it comes to Japan. You want to have some credibility behind you and so show some understanding of your subject matter and who would be interested in it. Those are some of the things that come to mind.
I did another book for another publisher, and it was on the Gokagai subject of Geikwa Maiko. And it's just at the tip of the, I just interviewed the top people in those places and describe the roles. It's such a world that you can't really go into very deeply, but of course foreigners are really fascinated with it. So at the end, instead of bibliographies, I just have references to BBC documentaries. And I kind of like that idea, and I hope I can do a little bit more of that instead of a bibliography of a book. I love bibliographies. Thank you. But I also would like to go into, you want to see a B&B, you want to go there and you want to see how the rooms are and if you're going to rent it or not. I'm wondering if bibliographies can move in that direction. When I'm lecturing or talking about the Ajari-san on Mount He, the only thing I can really suggest for people is to go back to their hotels and look at Marathon Monks, which is a 50-minute introduction to the austerities that people go through when they're climbing the mountain. And the same thing, the BBC on Becoming a Geiko, I guess it is. There's several, but that's the best one. And so I really enjoyed doing that in my books and letting people have a 50-minute movie or a documentary on the subject, because they're not going to pick up a book. And my explanations just you can't do it in a printed word. Sometimes the movie and the documentary.
I think that's a good idea.
So the link would be listed as one of the items in your bibliography.
And in ebooks, those links can actually be live. So if someone is reading your ebook, they can click on the link and immediately go to the documentary, or at least the site where the documentary is available.
Yeah, I don't have that book with me. Lynn has it right now. I saw another room, but it's a suggested viewing. That's it in the back. There's
suggested viewing. That's a good one.
This book really, really has forced me to have conversations a lot about adultery and prostitution and things that are not listed in the book, although it's admitted in dealing with the people in that world. So they get a little view. And so sometimes topics that are just impossible to cover on the printed word seem a lot more amenable if you have that like viewing, suggested viewing in the back of a book. I think the publishers in the future will go into that direction a lot more instead of just looking at it. I deal with restaurants. I'm wondering if I need to put videos instead of just the front of the restaurant. I'm a little worried about my restaurant guide because of COVID-19 has closed down a lot of places. Will they reopen? What's going to happen after this when the Olympics come? But people will be coming to Japan for the next year, and there'll be a lot of advertisement about Japan right now. So anyway, in the future of books, I think it's kind of a neat direction if you can just not only have a bibliography, but you can have suggested viewing in the back for your readers, because it does help you a lot and establish some kind of credibility about the worthiness and the truthfulness of the book.
Lynn, George asks, what was the name of the book you were holding up just now?
It's The Alluring World of Maiko and Geiko.
And they were very nice. Tanko Shah was very nice and asking me to write it, and I refused. And I said I'd have to do it my way. And of course, everything had to be translated into Japanese and get approved by Mr. Uno, who is the head of the Gion Association downtown. So what they did, which was very clever, the people I interviewed, which are all the different roles of people who are part of that world, are pink pages. And then the white page, the white back page, are the roles themselves of what is required for otokushi, the men who dress the women, and so forth. And at the end, so there's pink pages. And then I insisted on prostitution and Yoshiwara being represented. And they were very, very reluctant about doing that. And so finally, in the end, we were able to put a little kind of history of Yoshiwara and the prostitution bits. I can't really talk about it because they had illegal matters that couldn't be discussed in the book. And of course, we're trying to get away from the idea of Geiko and Michael being prostitutes. Different words are used. So anyway, it was interesting. So putting the BBC on becoming a Geiko there really, really helped a lot. But it forced me in a lot of different directions when I'm asked about the book. They're really curious about that world. And it's kind of a ho-hum world for me because I know a lot of the women, and it's hard to explain what the idea of adultery
I
is.
have no idea what this film is, but one of the films we were just before we started the formal part of this evening, we were chatting about the Japan Films Festival series that's just starting in the US at least. And one of the films is Michael Lady, I think. And I have no idea what the film is about, but it sounds like it's probably about.
Oh, that's silly. It was fun. It was the film based on My Fair Lady. It's kind of silly. It is really silly. And, at the end, she has her furiso kimono out and she's swirling around and around. It was the only bit of choreography that I really liked. But it's kind of a silly movie. It's not really serious. There's another American-made documentary with Lisa Dalby, which is very good. And the man who did Memoirs for a Gay, I think I listed that in the end. But actually the BBC one follows a woman through being shitomi, which is the first year entry, and then going on to be a maiko and a geiko, which is more authentic and true to the practice that it is. Becoming a geiko is like joining the army. It's not at all romantic. But anyway, there are a lot of sexual overtones to it, and it's all accepted in the society. So I cannot go into that when I talk to clients, but it's always fun. And their interest is really, really peak, even now, especially men. Women are like, huh, but men want to know a lot about it, So anyway, the documentaries help. And I think in food-wise, too, that it would be nice, too, to show some restaurants eating in the wild that do a lot of picking their own, ingredients and bringing them down. It might be a nice attachment to the eating in the wild, because there are restaurants that do that. They're terrifically expensive. We're talking lunch for $300, but it's you don't pick it, but they do. The people in the restaurant go out and pick the food and bring it down and prepare it for you. But just future-wise, I think it's nice to add, besides the bibliography, suggested viewing for the reader.
Well, I'm kind of curious what you all think about publishing books on Japan, seeing that they are, they're kind of representing a Japan for a non-Japanese audience.
I feel like the future is really in the all the new translators and the new translations that are coming out, rather than books about Japan. Although both of them seem, if this topic is right, they seem to be doing fairly well. But Peter, I wanted to ask you about one of my favorite books of yours, which is the Four Immigrants manga. But and what I was wondering is if you had any interest or opportunities to do more publishing about or in the Japanese American.
Well, funny you should mention this. This coming year, we have a contract to publish a book called Tabemasho, which is about Tabemasho, Let's Eat. It's a book about Japanese, kind of the history of Japanese American food and what Japanese Americans ate, starting with the early immigrants in Hawaii, and then how food was kind of brought in and how it's changed and all the ways it's kind of evolved, some of the influence of Western cooking. So that's going to be like a cultural history of Japanese food that we have coming up. We did this book called Being Japanese American by the same author. That was about 10 or 12 years ago.
Oh, Asakawa.
Yeah, Gil Asakawa.
Yeah.
He lives near you. He's in Denver. You know him?
Yes, yeah, yeah. And his brother's a photographer and is the official photographer for the University of Colorado.
Oh, I don't know his brother. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway.
Small world as usual.
Yeah.
Right. So that was a book about Japanese American culture, and it contained.
That's
it was
right.
fun.
How did it sell?
It did good for the first. I think it went through 2 printings, and it was a fun book. I did not grow up as a Japanese American, of course, but so it was really fascinating to me. All the like recipes and special words and jokes and anecdotes and little histories and, songs and stuff like that. It was really fascinating. And we did 2 years ago, we did a book called Little Exile, which was a memoir by Jeanette Arakawa, who, as a little girl in San Francisco, was taken with her family and interned I should say incarcerated, imprisoned in the Rower camp in Arkansas.
Yeah.
And this was her memoir, and it was a very sweet, charming book, despite its rather grim background. She was a little girl, so she didn't experience her life as, the way an adult might, with the same sense of outrage.
So Winnie, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I wanted to ask more about this concept that the author should also be the promoter and have their own. Sorry.
Why do you ask?
You have to have your own Instagram.
Their community. And I realized that this is expected of authors across the board by small publishers and big publishers, it seems as well, that authors are having to take on more and more. And from what I've heard, Stonebridge maybe even does more of the promotion than some publishers do. But to me, it feels like a really difficult thing. I guess you painted it as a kind of a positive thing, but like to me, it feels hard to write a book, like to have the skills or to do what it takes to do that part of the job. And as a journalist, I feel like it was a similar thing, like you were constantly being asked to take on other skills outside journalism and writing. It was data journalism, and it was photography, and it was video, and in addition to writing and reporting. And then there's this whole other realm now of promotion and having a social media platform and community that you're expected to also be good at. And I don't know, it feels like a lot, I guess, even though I realize it's necessary. I guess my question is, do you see that as necessary? And especially if you are going the self-publishing route, do you think you need to be one of these people with 50,000 followers and this huge social media community, or can you just be an ordinary author and succeed in this kind of new landscape?
Well, going back to what I was talking about before, it's just really hard to get people's attention. And it's one thing to have a publisher approach, put out an ad and like, buy this book, it's great. It's a completely different thing when the author comes up and puts themselves forward and has a chance to interact with readers who are really interested in her story. It's a much more effective way of reaching a reader and developing interest. There's a lot of value in it. By the same token, what you say is true. It's time consuming, and it's not necessarily a skill that a lot of writers have. From my perspective, and this would depend on the book, I guess, it's not really necessary that an author is able to do that, because I kind of think that in a sense, the book really is able to stand on its own. It doesn't necessarily need somebody constantly flogging it, particularly someone who's not comfortable flogging it or isn't, very good at it. That's not a very productive use of anybody's time. And I think, some books should be published regardless of whether the author is a great promoter, a bad promoter, or not even alive. We published a lot of books of authors who are no longer with us. So, I suppose every publisher has their own take on it. But if you were just to sort of say, what are the bare bone rules that everyone subscribes to, it kind of starts with, well, how mediagenic is the author? How good a job are they going to do connecting with readers? Do they have a website? All those things are like check marks in the plus column, to the extent that an author publisher has that, they're going to do better. If you just publish something and hope that it gets discovered, it's probably not going to happen unless you're just like super lucky and something wonderful happens. If you imagine going into a bookstore, all the books are spine out. What are the chances of you just kind of stumbling across the one book that you've been looking for your whole life? the odds are really against a book being successful without having any kind of promotion behind it. And the kind of promotion that a good author can do is very, very valuable. I think that's how publishers see it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And in terms of how big social media has to be in that equation, do you see it as really essential now, you know, having your Twitter following, or your Facebook or Instagram?
Well, I mean, when you think of your own self and where you go to find out about something, if somebody says, "Oh, have you heard about this?" First thing you're going to do is go onto Google, and you're going to expect to find something. And if all you find is an Amazon site, well, that's good. You know, so maybe Amazon has information about the book and has an extract, and you know that's good. But if it also has, here's the author, and here's what she's doing, here's her community, and oh, she's got a blog, and there are, you know, other people who are interested in the same thing that you're interested in, and I can connect with them because there's nobody in my podunk town that has a clue as what I'm talking about. So, I mean, there's just lots of real benefits to being able to do that. I don't know that. I think when it comes to social media, I think it's enough to have one. Some people really like Instagram. Some people really like Facebook. Twitter is not so important, I don't think, in the world of book publishing, unless you've got, you know, thousands and thousands of followers. But I mean, it is important.
Right.
It's certainly very effective, but I don't consider it, in my mind anyway, these days, I don't consider it essential.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if somebody really hated it, I'd still be happy to work with them.
Yeah. So Winnie, Emily has posted something in the chat that might be helpful to you. So you might want to
Okay. Thank you,
okay?
Emily.
Oh, Winnie has a great Instagram, don't you? So you're fine.
Okay, I can just go on posting pictures of plants and food.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll be good.
Totally. I was like,
You know,
oh, Winnie's promoting her
can't
book.
is
Like,
more
that's it.
important than anything. Yeah, I mean, it's a good-looking plant. It's a lot better than like 50 words about a plant. I mean, one good picture of a plant is good.
Exactly.
Yeah. You know, now,
maybe you should stress the eating more.
yeah.
More
Food's-
food. More
You've got lots of recipes in your book, so.
Well, you know, the underlying engine of everything is what's called metadata, and you're probably all familiar with that term. It's the description of the book, the name of the author, the description of the book itself, and then these keywords. There's maybe 15 to 20 different keywords and key phrases that it's really an art form to create them and to use them, because they are what brings your book up to the first page of the Google search. If your book is on the third page of Google, forget it. You know, I mean, really, that's how people think. You want to be on the front page, and you can pay money to Google to do that, and you can also, you know, manage your keywords. And there are people who just spend all their life doing that. I'm not recommending that, because I mean, that seems kind of a dreary life, but what they do. It's really important. That's why you see what you see on Google.
Yeah, I think as professionals, we've been all expected to master new skills that we didn't have or didn't need before.
Right.
Like we didn't need to have to work in layouts as translators until quite recently. But now a lot of clients expect you to actually go in and edit in the layout software.
Really?
Yeah. And
Wow.
I myself don't want to do that, but there are plenty of people among us who do, and they're very good at it.
Huh.
And
Does
also,
that mean you have to translate to a certain fit?
yeah. Well,
Oh.
I translate to a certain fit, but I always ask for a number of words. And then I just do that in Word. I don't have to worry about the InDesign settings, which can screw you up. But as far as like writing your own promotional blurbs or jacket cover or information about your work, I think we're being asked to do that kind of thing. And so it's not just the limited wordsmithing of the old days. We are often asked to do things.
Yeah.
we didn't before. And we're really learning a lot of that. We've really come a long way. Oh, Judith?
My nieces and nephews in San Francisco are crazy about this phenomenal Kimetsu no Yaiba, which is all over Japan. It's a movie now, and it's even playing on the Kabuki stage. It's a TV series. The movie will be released in the United States next year. It's already a movie, but only in Japanese here. So the future of interest in Japan, this is going to skyrocket. My nieces and nephews have no interest in Japan. They're crazy about Kimetsu no Yaiba. So if you're, this is a whole different genre. I'm not interested in it, but I have buying all this stuff for their Christmas gifts. I've got a whole boxes of this stuff that are going to go up. So the future of interest in Japan is going to focus more on this anime and this kind of stuff, which I cannot stand to look at. But it is now adopted as a play in the Minamiza. And they're not doing the traditional December Kao no Mise this year. They're doing, this really translates well into Kabuki, I would imagine. So the costumes and all of that. And
anime was certainly driving a lot of interest in people studying Japanese language. We used to hear that at the Association of Asian Studies. The professors would come by the booth and they'd be looking for books on anime that they could use to, keep their students interested. That's where the interest in Japan was coming from, and I imagine that's still true. I remember the days when Zen was big. There was even a novel back in the 1960s, wasn't it called Shibumi?
Yeah.
And who can forget James Clavell and Shogun?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So things have really moved along. Yeah.
Well, what you're saying, Susie, about the new translators, are you talking about new literary translators? Translators of Japanese literature?
Yeah, I guess that's what's standing out right now.
I know it's getting
nonfiction is not standing out.
Nonfiction is not as trendy, right. But there must be good stuff. There must be good stuff out there.
Well, I should mention that, we've been talking with the people from Monkey, the journal, the literature journal. We're hoping to work with them to figure out the ways of bringing more Japanese literature over into the U.S. market. So that'll be fun to do. And I expect I see a lot of review attention for new Japanese novels coming out. And that must have a lot to do with the quality of the translators.
Yeah, and you'll see a lot of them right here.
Yes. Well, kudos to you all. You're doing something right.
Gatherings. Yeah.
Well, if there are translators, are you getting support from the editors that you're working with? And if so, what kind of support are they like saying, oh, this doesn't work in English, you got to redo the whole thing? Or
so Louise is here. Louise has come out with a couple of really books that have been noticed. Are you there?
Yes. Hi, sorry, I am here.
And are you getting support from your publisher? And
Yes, very much. I published the Honjin Murders most recently with Pushkin Press in the UK, and they're very active on social media promoting the book. There seems to be someone there, for example, on Twitter, who always keeps an eye out for any comment that mentions it and retweets it immediately. And I get tagged in that, so I see there's been a comment about the book and I'm retweeting it again, so it builds up quite quickly. I'm sorry, I wasn't quite sure what the question was. Was that the question?
Well, I was interested in the editorial process, actually. So when you turned the translation in, was your editor there? Was he or she a Japanese reader? Did they know anything about the?
No,
they didn't. So how did they? Were they saying this has to work in English more than anything else? So they were working on did they spend a lot of time working on the English with you, or by the time it got to them, it was pretty much as it was supposed to be?
Well, the way it happened was I was commissioned to do it rather than I took the book to them.
Oh, okay.
In the beginning, they bought the rights and they contacted me. I've worked for them before, so they contacted me to do the book, and it's pretty much left up to me to do a complete draft without much communication with them while I'm doing the first draft. And then I send in the first draft, and at that point, an English native speaker editor works on it with me, and two of them, two different editors, the editor who commissioned it, and then a proofreader editor.
Right.
We talk about what needs to be left in Japanese, what needs to be explained, whether there's anything that needs to be cut or added. And yeah, the conversation only really starts after I've finished the full first draft.
So one of the things that often pops up in the manuscripts that we work with is that if there's a geographical place name that's mentioned, is it important that people know that it's in, say, northern Hokkaido or Kyushu or central Honshu, or can you just leave the place figuring that, well, nobody knows where it is, it doesn't really make any difference? And that's the sort of thing that as editors, we used to spend an awful lot of time on, putting in these sort of parenthetical or seemingly parenthetical remarks that were part of they read as part of the sentence, but they were really there to assist the reader in feeling a little more grounded with the text. Do you find editors still doing that with yours?
Yeah, we do talk about whether locations need to be made more specific. We tend to throw in somewhere like in northern Japan, or in in Hokkaido in the north, or Kyushu in the south, or a little bit extra like that on the whole, just to help people get grounded. But these days, your reader will Google everything.
Huh.
Reader will look up on Google Maps. Readers will look up the Honjin murders, of course, had a lot of Japanese words and Japanese architecture in it. For example, koto. I didn't go ahead and explain exactly what a koto. I didn't use the words, string instrument or anything like that. Just let people work it out from the context, and if they wanted to know what a koto looked like, they could Google it.
Koto is in Webster's, so that's easy.
Yeah, it's easy to look up. But yeah, these days I think a lot more Japanese words are being left in texts because of the ease of looking things up. That's
Meg, is that your experience too, Meg?
Yeah, I was just going to ask. Peter had been talking about the monkey project, so I was just wondering about what you might have to say.
So we sometimes use glosses to help readers. Sure. That's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
But
Well,
I think before that, the comment was, how much do your editors work with the translators? So since you're the editor side of it, then
right. So the monkey process involves 3 editors. It's quite rigorous. There first is Moto, who compares the translation to the original text and has a conversation with the translator about any spots where there might be, where he has some suggestions. And then Ted and I look at it. Ted usually has just a few comments, and then I do a copy / stylistic of everything. And the translators love it. I don't know. I think we have a
they're young enough.
What?
They're young enough to love it.
Oh no, some of them are in their 70s.
Oh really? Okay.
Oh.
Young at heart.
I mean,
we are bringing along some new, younger translators, but they are very well published. David Boyd, who translated Breasts and Eggs, that's getting so much attention this year. Polly Barton, Where the Wild Ladies Are, that also did really well this year. So they're young, but they're established translators.
That always seemed to be a big part of the job when I was at Tuttle and at KI was, particularly if it was a translation, the translation would tend to be fairly literal. It was accurate, but it didn't have the connective tissue, that a lot of American readers, particularly back then. I'm talking about like 1970s, 1980s. So that is the distant past, I guess. But we had to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to get all this information in, because we certainly didn't want to have a lot of footnotes. You know,
No footnotes.
yeah, the feeling was
That's the
you
death.
see a footnote, for every
Yeah.
footnote, someone dies and goes to heaven or something.
Yeah.
I had a quick look through the catalogue and I couldn't see any craft books. Is Stonebridge interested in publishing craft books of any kind?
Well, it's not a subject that I would necessarily shy away from. I guess it kind of depends on what the crafts book. If it's kind of a how-to book, how to probably not, because that's a different kind of hands-on market that I don't think we serve particularly well. There are other publishers that do a lot of crafts books that would be better. But if it was a book that made some sort of connection between crafts and culture, then that would probably be something that's kind of in our wheelhouse and would be of interest.
Okay. As anyone who knows me knows that my passion is sashiko, which is kind of gaining a lot of popularity now in the West. And there are a lot of interesting how-to books, but there are other cultural books on sashiko that I would just love to translate. So I'm always on the lookout for some.
I know that does Tuttle do a bunch of sashiko books? And there's a publisher in somewhere in Northern California that kind of specializes in those books as well. They've got a...
Yeah, I've just translated one for Tuttle. But but they're very particular. They want particular kind of how-to book. They're not so much interested in books with more historical or cultural background in sashiko. So yeah. Okay, I'll keep it in mind.
I'll be hearing from you, right?
All right, I've got a huge collection.
Anybody else?
I just want to say to Allison, this is a perfect segue into showing a video with the book of somebody doing it.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Very good. I'll buy it.
Yeah, that really helps, because sashiko is it's not just simple stitching,
No,
you got to see how it's done.
Yeah.
Well, I guess there's a YouTube video about almost everything now, right?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, that definitely is. Yeah. So video plus text would be the perfect combination.
So it has to become a multimedia effort, not just so in the back, not just bibliography, but for further reading or for further viewing or
I don't know if you remember in the early 90s, there were these ebooks that were multimedia, the so-called Rocket Reader, and you'd have the text that looked like an ebook, but there'd be little points where you could press a little button and you get sound effects, or you could get a link to a video and whatnot. And they were kind of like CD-ROMs, but they were in a slightly more compact form. And they never caught on. They just never sold enough. They were very, very expensive to produce. And when you get into video and sound and music, you get into all this licensing, and then it becomes very expensive, very restrictive. And books are great. They're really, all things considered, they're pretty cheap entertainment. They're not that expensive to produce relative to everything else that is being produced these days. And I don't know, they're a real democratizer of information. Anyone can have a book, anyone can read a book, anyone can write a book. So keep writing.
Well, on that wonderful note,
keep writing.
We could thank Peter for his sharing of his experiences and his opinions about editing and publishing, and everybody else for sharing their questions and the comments too. And let's end the formal portion. How's that?
Thank you very much, Beth. Thanks, everybody. It was really, especially old friends and authors out there. Thanks for turning up.